Try that again.
Okay.
Claire Miller is the Chief Executive Officer of the New South Wales Irrigators Council. Claire, thanks for joining us again on Flow.
Thanks so much for having me back on, Ricky.
It's naturally the lifeblood of your industry, the Murray-Darling Basin, so we talk about the Basin Plan very regularly. What have you observed just during this recent flooding event in your part of New South Wales?
Well, we're observing a number of really positive outcomes. So we're seeing, obviously a lot of bounce back with vegetation. We're seeing, breeding up of a lot of your native fish. But, all sort of events like this also have a downside. And what we're also seeing across the basin is the breeding up of invasive species like carp. Now, they're invasive species for a reason because they're very, very successful. So they just bounce back in overwhelming numbers, way, way better than the native fish do. And our concern about this is it demonstrates that, we can put all of this extra water through the system, but actually you've got these these environmental degradation drivers like invasive species of carp that, unless we address those, any additional water that you might add for the environment is really only tinkering around the edges because, if you'll talk about helping native fish, they need habitat, they need good water quality. Carp affect water quality. They just outcompete the native fish for food. They're about 80 to 90% of the biomass. So what we're really sort of seeing in this is there's billions of dollars and a sense of urgency with the idea of, we have to just keep adding more water, taking more water from farmers and adding more water into the rivers, and that's going to fix everything. What this really shows is, look, we've already returned 2,100 gigalitres from farmers to the environment, in addition to the bulk of the inflows that the environment already gets. It amounts to 1 in 3 litres of irrigation water that is, now added to the environmental side of the ledger. So a lot of the over-allocation problem has been resolved. So where's the billions and the sense of urgency at this point to start really investing in and addressing these environmental degradation drivers? Without addressing those, then we really are just tinkering around the edges.
Yeah, Claire, I was up in Renmark in the Riverland where I grew up during the holiday period, and I saw the carp gulping away there on the edge of the water, sunning themselves. It's like the old saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. All the fish benefit, the pests and otherwise, from a flood. But what are some of the initiatives you're suggesting, the Irrigators Council of New South Wales, when it comes to how we could actually help, say, the iconic Murray cod get a leg up against these carp?
There's been monitoring by scientists under the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office. So they're looking at Murray cod populations and how they're responding to these conditions across the basin. And what they've found is that surprisingly, we weren't able to actually find a cod in a particular stretch of the Darling River. And they sort of put the decline there down to a range of factors. The impact of introduced carp. So if we're going to, help our native species like cod, we need to do something about the carp. But also, the removal of habitats from modification of the rivers. So, looking at presence of weirs that obstruct fish migration, overfishing, poor water quality. Again, I come back to the carp being an issue there. So there's a number of things that we can be investing in that are really going to boost our native fish and make the most of the water that's being returned to the environment and so on. So we just need to move away from this simplistic, let's just add more water, to really facing up to the true complexities of the environmental degradation drivers that we need to now focus on.
Claire Miller from the New South Wales Irrigators Council we're speaking with here, and when it comes to irrigation, I recall reading somewhere there had been some innovation or development when it came to, I guess, the irrigation intakes, the actual pipes taking in the water from river channels and fish that might get caught in those. There'd been some development in that. I imagine there would be some problems with, carp and other fish getting caught in those.
Oh, this is a very exciting, has a lot of potential, this. So there's been a program in a couple of the northern rivers where they've been supporting farmers to put fish screens onto their irrigation pump intakes. What the benefit for the farmers is you're not getting, quite frankly, chewed up fish in your pump, and then you've got your repair costs and downtime and so forth. And of course, the benefit is we're not getting native fish caught up into that. So we really want to see this sort of done right across the basin, sort of support for farmers, funding support for farmers to put these fish screens onto their pumps. It's an absolute no-brainer, win-win for the environment and for farmers.
Now, there's some material you've sent us over the last 24 hours, and one of them points to a belief that there's about 28% of inflows in the Murray-Darling Basin are now attributable to irrigation, towns and industry. Do you have an idea what that's come down from? And, is that as low as you can go?
So that's come down from around 35% pre-basin plan. So it sort of sounds perhaps like 7% doesn't make a lot of difference, but ecologically speaking, it really makes a huge difference, particularly in droughts. That shift is what is being credited with saving the rivers in the 2019 mega drought that we had. That bit of extra water for the environment is what made all the difference. Of course, that reduction in what farmers were able to use puts them in a much more precarious position for surviving drought. So it does come at a pretty big socio-economic cost that we need to recognise. Look, that 28% is well within sort of internationally accepted sort of ranges for maintaining a healthy river system. Around that sort of 28% of total inflows going towards irrigation. It's not just irrigation, but other types of farming like livestock and stock and domestic, and of course towns and industry as well. So when you're looking at, can it come down further, you then need to start looking at what are the environmental gains you would get by simply reducing the water that's available for growing food and fibre, putting the clothes on our backs and the meals on our tables, versus the marginal additional environmental benefit that you would get from pulling those diversions down even further. And I guess this comes to the heart of what we're talking about here, which is I guess you could do that. And certainly there's people who feel that's we need to keep going down that path of more and more and more water recovery from farmers. But as I said, you're only tinkering around the edges unless you start really investing and putting the money and the time and the effort into addressing the actual degradation drivers themselves. And that is things like invasive species, cold water pollution, poor water quality. There's a wide range of those drivers.
Plenty on the agenda as the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, theoretically reaches a 2024 conclusion date. What do you see as the big sort of talking points that we need to be looking at maybe in the first half of this year as this Basin Plan comes to a pointy end?
I think we really need to be thinking about what's the Basin Plan all about, really. The Basin Plan is about a healthy, resilient river system and healthy, resilient communities. Now, the water recovery targets in 2012, they're based on a model. That model has a lot of assumptions in it, and we've learned a lot in the last 10 years, though, about whether those assumptions hold true. How much wood do you need to sort of hit the KPIs in the basin? Those KPIs, particularly in the lower lakes and the Coorong, are already being hit with the 2,100 gigalitres that's being recovered under the basin. So the question now is to say adaptive management is you learn by doing. And what we're really seeing now is the focus needs to go to integrated land and water catchment management across the basin to get the best out of this massive reform, and so that the communities, particularly those irrigation-dependent communities that have given up a lot for this reform in terms of socio-economic impact, can see the benefits of that. This is their backyard. They want to see that in return for that, they do have these healthy river systems, and that means addressing issues like your invasive species control, sort of integrated land and water management where for example, irrigated agriculture also has a lot of habitat value. We're sort of recognising that these are not in silos, it is a mosaic landscape, and really sort of collaborating and working with communities to make the most of that.
You mentioned the assumptions in the Basin Plan. Just one last question before we go. Do you think there was an assumption in the Basin planning when it was first drawn up, in the midst of the fears and concerns about drought, that we wouldn't see a flood of the magnitude, not far below a 1956 that we've just been experiencing?
Absolutely. The Murray-Darling Basin Plan is a creature of the Millennium Drought. The Millennium Drought was savage, 12 years. And it led to unprecedented low inflows, unprecedented low water availability for any kind of farming. It was scary, and of course the environment suffered terribly in that. So the basin plan is very much, to my mind, is a product of a focus on climate change and drought side of it. What the last 3 years has been a good reminder is actually there's two ends of the extreme here that we need to be managing for. And, so it's about, as I say, sort of greater resilience for the environment, but also you've got to think about resilience for those farming communities in drought as well, and then making the most of these flood years, these wet years, as a reset for the ecology, but also for those farming communities.
Good points, Claire Miller, the CEO of the New South Wales Irrigators Council. Always good to chat as we keep tracking what's happening in the Murray-Darling Basin. Thanks for joining us today on Flow.
No worries. Thanks very much again for having me on.